period. What we see emerging is rather a new passion for witnessing. What MSF members express in their acts and in the stories that they tell about those acts is a desire to become and to be witnesses. And in their view, witnessing is not something that one does only for altruistic reasons. It is not something that one does only in order to protect others. One should seek to become witnesses, in their view, also in order to fulfill one's own goals in life. In other words, there's a sense that witnessing is the way to lead an ethically meaningful life. That witnessing is first and foremost an existential act. So a new passion for witnessing. Where does this new passion for witnessing come from? That's the next question that I want to address. To what can we attribute this urge that so many people share to become witnesses to third world emergencies? So there are actually many factors behind this emotional investment in witnessing. I cannot relate to all those factors right now, but I would only dwell on two factors. So first, I would like to suggest that the popularity of witnessing reflected the decline of political ideologies, and in particular, the disillusionment with Marxism. And this disillusionment was felt especially strongly by members of the French left. And in this new political constellation, witnessing and humanitarian activism more generally are conceived as a way to influence political matters without succumbing to the ethical compromises that an ideology-driven politics entails. Kouchner, for example, Bernard Kouchner, whom we just mentioned, spoke of humanitarian engagement as a personal political act. That's a quote, a personal political act. So in other words, what I'm saying is that in a growing circle of humanitarian activists, being a witness was actually conceived as the only ethically consistent way to be engaged in political life. So that's one of the factors behind this new passion for witnessing that we see emerging. And the second one, well, it needs to be remembered that Médecins Sans Frontières is an organization that was founded by physicians. And their quest for an ethically meaningful life is in many respects a reaction to the legitimacy crisis that the medical profession was undergoing since the late 1960s. Because in that period, physicians increasingly felt that in their Western medical practice, the human dimension has been lost.
What techniques did doctors without borders use at the time?
Témoignage, what's the term?
What techniques did doctors without borders use? Like when they gave stories in newspapers and they videotape it and release it?
What techniques? Okay, they use a broad range of techniques. And what is even more important to realize is that those techniques are in dispute. And that's the point that I'm heading towards. And those techniques are constantly evolving. what they used during the 1970s is not what they used during the 1990s. In the 1970s, we get some public statements that resemble in a way the kind of public statements that Kushner and his friends came out with during the Biafra crisis. That is basically an accusation, or more politicized kind of witnessing, if you wish. But what we mostly get are travel tales, I guess. That's the way to call it. Just first-person narratives by physicians who come back from a mission and tell stories about, the kind of exotic experience that they've had. But that's not the kind of that's not the full spectrum of witnessing, and I'm not giving you a full answer because I'm going to talk about it in a minute. Okay? So I would prefer to take more questions towards the end. So if it's fine, is it? Can I continue? Okay. So just to come back to the legitimacy crisis of the medical professions that stood behind the adoption of witnessing by Médecins Sans Frontières, by Doctors Without Borders. So it was felt that the technological innovations and bureaucratic requirements did not leave much room for a meaningful encounter between physicians and patients. And it was precisely this human encounter that physicians sought to retrieve by going on a mission to disaster zones and by becoming witnesses to distant emergencies. Now, it is important to say that witnessing, and here I'm coming back to your question, witnessing didn't lose its conventional sense as an act of factual representation, as it was starting to be pursued with such a passion. And actually, since the late 1970s, documentation of the condition of victims in third world emergencies was perceived as one of the forms that becoming a witness could take. But, and this is a crucial point, already in that stage, the documentation of the conditions of the victims was regarded as only one possible track that one could follow in order to become a witness to third world emergencies. And in fact, as soon as witnessing was introduced as the watchword of a new generation of humanitarian activists, then it was already in dispute. And for MSF members, it was clear from the beginning that being present in disaster zones and going on a mission to places that were under the radar of most Westerners was only a first step in the fulfillment of their obligation and urge to become witnesses. But then the question emerged. What had to happen next in order for this obligation to bear witness to be fulfilled? So, as I said, there were various and competing answers. Some of MSF's activists argued that witnessing is best fulfilled by providing medically certified information on the physical condition of the victim, kind of an objective, even pseudo-scientific discourse. But others considered that the ethical burden of witnessing is only lifted when activists renounce this objective and pseudo-scientific tone and openly express their critique and indignation. For some, being a witness entailed being present by the victims while quietly attempting behind the scenes to persuade policymakers to do something to end their plight. But for others, witnessing was meaningless if it was not performed in the limelight of the media. And according to that view, activists acted as witnesses only when they staged spectacles of witnessing, in which their own moral sensibility occupied center stage. So I cannot discuss in detail those conflicting interpretations of witnessing, but I would only want you to pay attention to the fact that this conflict occurred and that it still erupts from time to time. I want you to pay attention to the fact that the most stable characteristic of humanitarian witnessing that can be drawn from looking back on the contemporary history of humanitarian witnessing is that humanitarian witnessing does not have one single form or meaning. There is actually a struggle going on between humanitarian practitioners over what I would call the legitimate definition of witnessing. And in fact, this conflict and this struggle should not surprise us, because they are nothing but the logical consequence of that new passion for witnessing that I mentioned earlier. Why? Once the witness is no longer something that one is by virtue of being accidentally found in certain objective circumstances, but rather something that one becomes, there can be no a priori criteria of what constitutes witnessing. If individuals can willfully turn themselves into witnesses, and if they do it in order to fulfill what they take to be their own moral responsibility, then it is up to them to define when that responsibility is indeed fulfilled. And as we've seen, when it comes to making sense of witnessing, activists rarely speak in one voice. Okay, so I come to my conclusion. So basically what I wanted to argue thus far is that since the 1970s, humanitarian activists have shown a new passion for witnessing. And I've also argued that this passion created a climate in which the tensions between disparate models of witnessing would turn into an open conflict. But I would like to end by pointing to another consequence of this new status of witnessing. And I would like to point your attention to the fact that witnessing as passion also created a climate in which the limitations of witnessing could be openly dealt with by the same humanitarian activists that embraced witnessing as their duty. So I would like to demonstrate this point by a very recent example. On the screen, you can see excerpts from an op-ed that was published in September by Unica Unakara, who is the president of the International Council of Médecins Sans Frontières. And this op-ed was quoted in many newspapers and media channels around the world. So in that piece, MSF's president refers to the recent crisis in Somalia, where, as you probably know, hundreds of thousands of people are